Well, thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining on the big return of winter today. We're up in the Camas Valley up here, and we got the snow piling up. We're all skiers and snowboarders up here too, so we're pretty excited to get out tomorrow morning. My name is Brendan Coyle. I'm the founder and winemaker here at Dendrick Estate. I'll just give kind of a brief introduction to Dendrick Estate is and what we're doing up here and kind of what where the idea germinated from. I have with me today also our estate horticulturist, Max Etchell, and we'll be kind of handing it back and forth today. And you'll kind of see why from our backgrounds and expertise. But I'll kind of kick it off here and give you an overview of what we're doing up here and kind of the big why behind all of this. Just a quick background on myself. I've been in alcoholic beverage production my entire life. So I started life in the brewing industry as an apprentice brewer. I have a master's in brewing and distilling sciences from a school over in Scotland, which is kind of like a chemical engineering microbiome split graduate degree. I was the master distiller at High West Distillery for the better part of 20 years, and I actually just left last year to launch Dendrick Estate. This is a project that's been in the making since 2019 when we acquired the land. And I was kind of moonlighting it for the past 5 years or so through COVID, doing a lot of research and development up here. But officially launched the brand and the product. And it's a unique time because we are moving from a research and development stage of the business into a production stage of the business. So it's pretty exciting for us up here right now. And so, kind of the why behind this, like I said, I've been in production my whole career. I've really had like a deep, love and admiration and interest in fermented beverage technology, fermenting foods of all types, actually, on the culinary side and on the beverage side. And really, how this came to be was I was in alcoholic production, beverage production my whole career, but I never had a connection to the agriculture with everything that I've done. I was in the never had a brewery in a hop field, never had a distillery in a grain field. And what I always wanted to do was bring that full circle together and put together a project, just like an estate vineyard, just like a winery, estate vineyard, to bring a project to light that had a full, complete loop to it that started with the agriculture and a consumer could come on site and really experience the product and the agriculture from which it came and the entire process from point A to point B to get there. Wineries are a great example of this. But like I said, I'm a skier. I want to live in the mountains. And so I wanted to do this up near Park City, Utah, where I've been my whole time in Utah here. And an estate cidery made a ton of sense because you can have a nice orchard, especially a nice cider orchard up at elevation. Whereas a vineyard, you got to go further down south in elevation. And it just didn't have the same fit that I thought that I really wanted to do. And so let me just keep this going here. And so what we have done is in 2019, we bought 20 acres of land in the heart of the Camas Valley, right in between Camas and Oakley, if you're driving north on State Road 32. And we have 20 acres, of which 15 acres is devoted to the agriculture, and 5 acres is devoted to the production house, which is the photo right in the middle there. That's our mill and our wine press in the middle of the facility, and our tank, our Charmat tank on the back corner there. And what we've done is assembled equipment from really all over the world used to make wine style ciders. And you're going to hear me talk about cider and wine interchangeably because cider is a style of wine. And we've put together a small production facility here. And like I said, over the past about 4 years, we've been doing all the research and development. I tried to find the tell-all book on how to do this at 6,500 feet in elevation in northern Utah, but it didn't exist. So we decided to write it. And so for the first 4 years, we planted, over 40 different varietals. We tested all these different types of farming and irrigation methods. And ultimately, over the past 4 or 5 years, we kind of found what works for us on this site at this elevation with our soil type and producing the types of apples that we need to make the styles of ciders that we want to make. And so we have our irrigation, or excuse me, we have our research and development orchard right now that is now winding down its research phase, and we're winding up the production phase. So it's time to take those successful varietals, those successful methods, and plant those out at scale in a high density setup that Max is going to talk about here in a minute, and really create that estate agriculture feel because we launched our first product last summer in July of 2025. It's our first cider product that came to market. And now we're looking to build a tasting room, full bar, full kitchen tasting room in the future to really tie the whole package and the whole experience together. And so Max is going to talk a little bit about our operation here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Max Etchell. I've got a background with a fruit and crop science degree from Cal Poly, but grew up here originally and moved back and getting into the background or not into the background, but into the setup here. Our operation is on 3 acres. Right now we have planted on the 20-acre estate. Our planting density is 1,200 trees per acre. So that puts us at a 3 foot spacing between trees and a 12-foot spacing between the trellis rows. We're up high elevation here at 6,500 feet in the Camas Valley. And as Brendan was saying, we're doing this research and development. So we have over 30 cultivars planted out right now, looking at what grows best here, kind of figuring out what our management strategies are as far as what our biggest problems are, what cultivars work best against those problems, and what management strategies also work best against those problems. In the spring coming up here, our acreage will be doubling, and we'll get a little bit more into the two cultivars we selected from those 30 and why we chose those two later in the presentation. So our workflow throughout the year, we have an overall very short season. As we were talking about, as was mentioned earlier in the first presentation of this conference today, we're at less than 100 frost-free days here. So we have a really short season. We have very small weather windows, and all of our management practices reflect this. We have a super high speed of pace, and we've got to match the climate here, and everything needs to move very quickly to reflect that. What comes with that is where we are right now. We're in this long dormant mode within the orchard right now, which gives us a long time for preparation, and also gives us the benefit of being able to grow some really high chill hour needing varietals. With that also comes the need for frost mitigation, as mentioned also earlier in this conference. So we have a within this high density system, we have a trellis and training system. We put out all of the 30 cultivars on a 4 wire system that's 9 feet high, but each cultivar needs a little bit different of a training method, to some degree. And this comes down to the crop load management. Some of our varietals are very heavy croppers and not biennial bearers, which ultimately affects the training system employed, but also whether they're spur or tip bearing varietals. We are actually growing two notorious tip bearing varietals here, Gold Rush and Harrison, well-known cider varietals that are tip bearers. And so figuring out how to do that on a high density trellis system has been a pinpoint of our pruning process. We have 500-foot long rows, the trellises, and we set that length as our maximum length, recommended from Cornell actually, as far as the strength of what these systems can hold. We have these H braces at the end, and as you can see, very, very big trellis posts that ultimately allow us to get through these harsh winter conditions with extreme winds and snow bearing as we're seeing right now, and also support the weight of the crop to come. Getting into our irrigation system, and this is one of our big sustainable practices that we're doing and implementing on the orchard right now, and we're going to get more into that in the coming slides. But we have micro sprinkler emitters. This allows us to have extremely precise irrigation. We can focus on our ET requirements and hit those ET requirements within very little range of error. All of our fertilizer is going through these micro sprinklers through the fertigation system. That also allows us to apply very precise amounts of fertilizer to our trees to prevent any sort of runoff or leaching. Also, to kind of to go with this preventative of runoff and leaching, we have a living mulch. Obviously, it's very aesthetically appealing, and it's nice to be able to walk through an orchard with some sort of grass sod growing in the tractor rows, but also at the end of the day is protecting the watershed from any nutrient runoff and leaching that could happen within the orchard. Getting into some integrated pest management, we have really low insect pressures up here. This past season, we saw only a handful of codling moth and oblique-banded leaf rollers. I definitely don't want to be naive to the fact that this will become more of a problem as our growing degree, or sorry, as our insect degree day models increase. And we're just giving them a more continued and longer food source by establishing this orchard here. So I would imagine that especially codling moth is going to be increasing in the near future. We also saw some rosy apple aphids, but no scales or woolly apple aphids were found. As far as our biggest concern, we have a really high fire blight pressure up here, and we have an emphasis on organic management. We're not certified organic, but all of our practices that we are employing in the orchard are organic. And we have an emphasis on biological control within that organic management. So we are using copper to treat the fire blight, but we're also employing Blossom Protect and Serenade, which are two biological controls that work against fire blight and can be relatively effective against fire blight when employed in the correct management strategy. So when we're not using biological control, we're focusing on soft chemistries, being low metallic copper sprays. Um, and we also have a high importance of monitoring, right? So we know what's out there and what quantities at what densities and what our economic thresholds are to take action upon those specific populations. And recognizing that because we're a cider orchard, and these apples will be going to processing, that our economic threshold is a lot lower than a typical culinary apple. Um, and that we need to reflect that when setting our economic thresholds.
So Max came onto the team, obviously well into the research phase of this orchard. And I was making decisions in the early days, obviously with what are the requirements for the types of ciders that we want to make going forward, was the number one criteria. And how that intersected with what we thought would do well here at elevation, like in our climate here, where we like to say that we're kind of agriculture on the fringe up here because you just don't see a lot of apple orchards, north of 6,500 feet in elevation in this kind of a location here, with much less desert influence like than what they have down south. And so, we very quickly decided that, we're going to be focusing on a lot of crab style varietals. And that's really a good thing for us because the types of ciders that we're looking to make are ciders that benefit from high acid, particularly, and also high tannin varietals. I'd say high acid being the more important of the two. And so when you look at our business as a whole, we are an estate cidery, but we never have the goals to just grow 100% of all the fruit that we use in our ciders here. It's always going to be a blend. We're always going to be sourcing fruit from other locations. We want to keep that as close as possible. And we always want to grow a certain percentage of our own fruit here, specifically the ones that grow very well at the high elevation in our setting here, and particularly the ones that are just harder to find. We have made kind of a conscious decision to start transitioning to more and more red flesh varietals up here. They're very unique, obviously, and they do very well for, rosé style ciders. They drive a lot of intrigue and interest in the consumers with the success of rosé wines and things like that. And so we will do some kind of more classic, maybe more English or French, bitter sharps or bitter sweets up here, but much fewer of those than you would see like traditional crab style varietals. With Max mentioning that we're 100% organic management to date, we're going to focus on varietals that have great disease resistance. Fire blight is no joke. We learned the hard way for the first 4 or 5 years up here. And so we're particularly interested in varietals with a very high fire blight resistance to them. With our planting coming up this spring, we have another about 33 or 3,400 trees going in this spring. It's just a mix of Virginia Hughes and Redfield, those first two there. Those were the first that we selected to go forward with, based on with all the criteria considered that I've just mentioned. Dolgo and Harrison are also very interesting to us, and likely get some more planting in the future. Ultimately, we've trialed now over 40 varietals to date up here, and we'll probably focus on just 5 or 6, maybe 7 for the full 15 acres planting. And so with our planting, we planted a density just a little bit higher than 1,000 trees per acre. And so with this next 3 acres going in, 3+ acres going in this spring, We are focused on that because that's going to be surrounding the outdoor event space and the tasting room. And we plan on having a capacity up to about 150 people or so at any given time for events or for daily service. And then once we have that 3 acres established and growing and filling in the central block planting for us here, we'll now kind of turn our focus back onto the original research and development plot, which is about another 3 acres in size. And we'll start doing replants in that area over time to kind of transition that research and development plot over to now our production plot. And then the last piece that we'll be doing is the eastern block that comes out to State Road 32. Our property, our 20-acre property, is a nice kind of rectangle that makes it kind of perfect to separate into thirds for our 500-foot long rows with separation in between. And so that's what we're focused on here this spring. Ultimately, we're putting together a unique business up here because you've heard others present today and in the previous days. And we're not just focused on the quality of the fruit, we're also focused on the guest experience. And we're ultimately focused in the end on creating a value-added consumer product at the very end of the line. So it's this kind of three-way Venn diagram of what we're trying to do up here that makes our choices very unique for our location and for our brand and for like kind of the long-term vision of this project. So with that, I'll kind of go into a little bit of the cider making process. I know I won't spend too much time on this here. It's a little bit of small deviation from what we're focused on this afternoon, but it's an important part to our plan here and what we do. I mentioned before, cider is wine, and I use those two words interchangeably all the time. Most people don't even know that cider is a style of wine because historically, over the past 50 plus years in America, it's really been positioned next to and an alternative for beer. It's like this beer alternative product. And I've had the opportunity to travel internationally a bunch and live a bit internationally. And in other parts of the world, in specific areas, they consider cider like wine and even so like a fine wine. It's treated like fine wine. And that's what I was introduced to studying and traveling abroad. And when I came back to the States, it was very hard to find. It was almost non-existent unless you were in some very niche areas, in like New York and Washington and Michigan and some other areas, but very, very hard to find. And so that's what really kind of where the idea germinated for me was to treat cider as it is wine, use classic winemaking methods throughout the entire process, and ultimately get to a product that compares to wine, both through its kind of its history and heritage, as well as the process going into it. So we operate on the seasons, just like a traditional winery does. Fruit comes in the fall. The picture you see here is our crush and press operation just right before we got it operational when we were getting certificate of occupancy on the building. 900-pound bins come in there on the left. They're dumped into the wash basin with a quick wash and then a hand sort by the operator. We can also pull out off-spec fruit that might have been taken too far with insect pressure or anything like that. And so we can remove any off-spec fruit before it goes up the elevator. You'll get another rinse, a little freshwater rinse going up the elevator before it finally drops into the mill, positioned above the press there. That's a 400-gallon wine press. And so we'll actually put in for all the fruit that goes into that press, we'll be able to fit about 24 or 2,600 pounds or so of apple fruit into that press. And we'll actually take about 76 or 77% of the weight of that charge out as juice. So it's a very efficient press. It's a modern, it's actually an inert gas membrane pneumatic press. And so we have the ability to charge that press with nitrogen or carbon dioxide. So we minimize the oxygenation breakdown of the fruit during the pressing cycle. And there is a pneumatic membrane inside that press that will actually go through a repetition of inflation, pressing, and then deflate, relaxation, and then that whole drum will turn and mix the fruit to gain more access to more juice and ultimately increase our efficiency. It'll go through that process 20 to 25 times, depending on what cycle I choose, to get the best quality juice and the best quantity of juice from that charge. And then from there, we move on to fermentation. We ferment in 300-gallon and 500-gallon, ultimately totes, either inert poly totes or stainless steel totes as well. It just depends on the volume and ultimately where it's going in the end. And then we'll go through really about an 8 to 10 month process of two different fermentations. A primary fermentation where yeast converts sugars to carbon dioxide and alcohol. A secondary fermentation where bacteria converts the acid profile inside the wine. So it'll actually convert malic acid to lactic acid with the right type of bacteria inside naturally over a 2 or 3 month period. That's really important for the mouthfeel, the structure, the brightness of the wine. And then after that, secondary fermentation is all done, we'll actually continue to age on lees or on yeast, which is very important to the flavor profile, for an additional several months before that flavor profile comes into balance and it's deemed ready for blending, final blending, and ultimately we'll go on to the final stage, which is final blending and a third fermentation, which is known as the Charmat process. It's an Italian process, and it's actually the exact same way that Italian Prosecco wine is made. And so we'll take our now eligible fermenters that have been on yeast for 10 plus months, and then we'll go into this final blending, this final fermentation, where we bring back yeast into the picture. We add a little bit of sugar or fresh juice because we need some sugar to make this final fermentation. And then 100% of that sugar will be fermented into carbon dioxide. And it will be bone dry, so there'll be no sugar left over in the process. And we will then have a very bright, sparkling, bone dry, relatively high acid, sparkling wine that goes into bottling for cork and cage and off for package to be sold throughout Utah. So we're in Utah right now. We've got about 60 or 70 accounts across Salt Lake City and Park City. We're entering the liquor stores and general distribution for Utah in the next 2 months. So you'll see us in liquor stores and more accounts. And ultimately, we'll start some direct consumer sales. At that point, we'll be available probably about 8 or 10 states across the nation. Now, we want to talk about sustainability a bit. That's really important to us up here. Like Max mentioned, we have organic management, and we have a lot of initiatives towards our sustainability up here. But water conservation and water reuse is by far the number one. We have made a commitment to move down the track of a goal of 100% reuse, digestion, filtration, and reuse of our wastewater on site here, reuse as irrigation water to our trees in the summertime. We're currently talking to the state of Utah. We're in the permitting process right now. It takes several years to get there, but we have already installed our systems in place. Most of the system, about 80% of the systems installed. The last thing we have to do is add a level of sterile filtration. We're gonna the way that it works in Utah is you're essentially held to a very high level of certification if you plan to distribute that water as irrigation water above ground instead of below ground. That's the big cutoff. If we're distributing the water below ground, the tolerance is much more open for the levels of like E. coli and things like that inside the water. But because we have micro sprinkler emitters that run in line with our trellis wires, we have green row middles, living mulch row middles. We need to distribute that water above ground, and so that puts us into a much more stringent bracket for certification. So what you see here on the right-hand side is our Arenco unit. We essentially installed a four-chamber, four-compartment biodigestion system. It's aerobic digestion. So wastewater comes in. The other three tanks that are not in this picture are underground to the north there that you can't see. This picture here is of the final stage of aerobic digestion and filtration. But the first three tanks, it comes into a collection and settling tank, and then into an aeration tank is the second tank where you can provide an enormous amount of oxygenation to the wastewater and have a flotation element to it. So you'll have settling that happens in that tank, you'll have flotation that happens in that tank, and you're ultimately adding a bunch of oxygen so that the bacteria and yeast can do its work downstream. And then in the third tank, we have a settling tank. And so that's where it's just a still settling tank where essentially the biodigestion starts and you have a large amount of sedimentation that happens in that tank. That's the tank that we would have to pump, once a year and dispose of off-site for like the sludge, just like a typical septic system has to be pumped, every so often. And then what you're seeing here in this picture is the fourth and final tank, which is where the aerobic digestion continues at a much faster rate, much faster scale, bigger scale. And then filtration, you see those white filter pockets lined all throughout that unit. Essentially, what's happening here is those gray pipes that run along the tops of the filters there sprinkle the water out, and then it percolates down through the filters. And embedded in the filters are the natural yeast and bacteria of previous wastewaters that have come through. So it's naturally inoculated. That's how it works best over time. And in the end, you're creating essentially a very clear and almost drinkable wastewater in the end. Like I said, the last step that we have to add once we get certification through the state would be that final sterilization step. And then we hope to bring 100% of our wastewater going forward in the future through this system. And that would allow us the ability to really not use over 1 million gallons of water per year that we currently pull out of the Weber River. We could just leave that right in the watershed and head down to the Great Salt Lake. So that's kind of the big pie in the sky goal for us. We're about a third of the way there, and we kind of want to bring everyone along the journey to get there with us as we build out the estate, add the tasting room, and grow from there. That's all that we have today. That's like the 30,000 foot level, a quick run through our the past 5 years of our life.
Way cool. Thank you so much for sharing. That's been fun to listen to. Very unique, especially at the elevation that you guys are at. A lot of fun to hear about. So, real quick, just for participants, we do have in the chat, Ruby put in that we do have a link to a survey that we ask everyone to fill out. It does help us evaluate how we did this year, but also it gives us the direction to go for next year. So the topics that were picked this year are a result from what you guys filled out last year. So we encourage you to fill that one out. Also,